so we have our molds all set up. We're happy where they are. Everything's fastened down, leveled out, which is great. And the next step is blocking. You want permanent blocking on each transom, the stern and the bow, and then additional blocking on the molds, which will allow you to fasten upwards into the keel so that you can have clamps get out of the way that will hold the keel down onto the molds and allow you to do your shaping and all that sort of stuff. Get your planks on there. And then these, you'll put tape on them. They won't get glued down, but you will glue these fore and aft. Those will be permanent, glued and screwed. They are structural. How do you get this angle? There's a couple different ways. When you are hoping to get your bevels off of the plans, you can lay your bevel gauge onto the line and adjust as needed. And now this is very small, and you're trying to create something that is scaled up quite a bit. As long as you have a straight edge, you have that transom is straight, and you have this little section that you know is straight, then you can find your bevel. And you do need to do that for your mold blocks. You can do this on every single one. What I've done is do blocking on the middle three. You'll find that when you spring the keel down, it sits quite nicely on these outer molds, and they don't really need to be fastened down. If you have a pre-beveled transom that you got with the kit, you can take the bevel with your bevel gauge and then cut your piece of wood to that angle. You have a 3/4 inch keel, so I have a little piece of 3/4 inch plywood, and what I did essentially loosely clamp this in place and figure out where this could be located in order to have my keel piece run flush with the top of that bevel. And then throw in a couple of screws, call it good. When you're making these blocks, it's a good idea to mark all over them. Mark where your bevel is. So I've found this bevel that's on the front face of station 6 going forward. So when I cut my block for station 6, I know it's meant to be on the forward face. The bevel's going to run downward, so I've made a little mark there that the bevel runs that way. The other thing I've done, you can kind of see, is created a guide hole for a nice long drywall screw. I've cut this face at a little bit of a bevel so that it's easier to run that screw up in and not have my drill be hitting the mold. And that guide hole makes it much easier for the drywall screw to really screw into that plywood and pull it down. I've done forward face of number 4, forward face of number 6, and the aft face of number 8 because you have that keel starting to dive down on that side. So I've assembled the keel already. We use the scarfing jig that is the same jig for the planks to scarf two pieces together. I've decided this is my forward end. This end stays square. On the stern end, you'll want to cut the bevel that matches the bevel of the block for the stern transom. The other thing that I've done is relieve a little bit of material. Because there's a lot of curve that has to happen, a lot of pressure on the board, taking away some of the material with the chamfer, and then taking away more material on the bottom will relieve a little bit of the tension in there and allow it to bend in a little bit more easily. I just use a simple 45-degree router bit to create a chamfer. This chamfer, you do want to sort of run it almost all the way out and then stop and then sort of taper it a little bit. This is just so that visually it looks okay next to that blocking, which ultimately is going to be hidden. Okay, that'll do. I've also added a center line. You should have one scribed on at least one side. I find it useful to have a center line on both sides, so I will take center points at certain a handful of points down the heel, lay a straight edge on it, scribe my center line. I've done that on both sides, and that allows me to use this to index on the center lines on the molds, as well as when I'm fairing from the molds up to the center line, I know I'm sort of moving evenly down the whole boat. So once you have your bevel on the stern part of the keel, you might find it's a little bit challenging to get it to stay in there. It doesn't necessarily want to bend because it's pretty thick. So what you can do is take a clamp. It's a little bit wonky, but so it goes. That creates a nice high point. Rest that on. That lets me get nice and close. Now that you have it held up a little bit, it'll dive into that bevel more easily. You want to line up your center lines for the keel and the transom. Make sure it's where it needs to be. I've already drilled for a single screw that's very long. It's very important that those are countersunk beyond where you're going to be removing material for your bottom planks. Same thing up at the bow. So for now I'm just going to clamp this in place. Like so. So once you have things sort of locked in at the stern, you can go ahead and eliminate your lift. And now the keel can kind of act as a batten. You have your center line on the keel, your center line on your molds, and you can see if it needs to shift one way or the other. It should lock pretty nicely into the molds that are provided with the kit, so shouldn't be too much of an issue. We've come to the front of the keel, the bow. The stern was beveled, but we leave this one square. The reason being, you can't have another bevel. You would have to sort of spring this up as well and shove it down in there. It's not necessarily feasible. I've got my block, which is found the same way as the one on the transom, either this bevel or pulled off of the plans. Located in the same way, up and down, with a piece of 3/4 to mimic the keel and get it even. And then I've created a notch to accept the square end straight down and in. So to get this location, you might squeeze it down and draw your line, and then you're just working your way down into that. What I do is use a squared chisel and run it on the side against that block and just slowly tap out, knock it down, remove material, knock it down, bring my keel piece down and check. I cut this piece so it mimics the shape of the end of the keel, which is not so totally square. It flares out just a tiny bit, but I use that as a means of seeing how my fit is doing. You want to be careful when you're doing this. Plywood's very different than chiseling out of a solid wood. It can kind of blow out. It can be a little bit funny and frayed. You do have epoxy to save the day if things go a little bit weird, but it is a good idea to sort of take your time and come into it. I've also put this piece of wood back in. I had it when I was originally setting up the jig and the ladder rail and everything. I've put it back in. I've moved it a little bit forward, put some really hefty drywall screws in the ends, and then I can use it to clamp this bow down in. Great. Seems pretty good. Up here I'm going to sink 2 screws in. One on either side of the center line, and I do have to make sure that they're at an angle running in so they don't pop out of the front of this block. And I do want to countersink them because I'm going to be taking a lot of material off on the keel up forward here. So I have drilled in for 2 screws and countersunk them quite a bit. Yeah, it should be nice and solid and just about ready to go. The next thing I want to do is, I mentioned the drywall screws that I have to go up through the blocks. I'm going to go ahead and drive those. I've removed the clamp on this mold, so this is mold number 4, and the same, number 4, and the same thing goes for number 8, where you can see how much this keel does spring off of this mold. So I'm going to clamp this back down and fasten it, but in order to prevent this whole mold, the force of the keel, from lifting this mold up and out of its slots, I've put a couple of squared off pieces of 2x. They're screwed in through the ladder rail and then through the mold, just to keep this particular mold as well as number 8, prevent the keel from lifting the whole thing up and out. So the whole setup is quite rigid, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to take a square, make sure that my molds are square to the ladder frame. So once I have this square, I know it's square to the ladder rail, I might draw a line even on both sides, just to sort of index the keel, so that when it comes time to take this off and glue up both ends, all the blocks and everything, I'll know where everything needs to be, and I don't have to mess around with things too much again. And you can go ahead and drive your screws. It should suck it down. Oops. Again, you can see that this one, not quite as much as at the bow, but this one does try to spring out. So I've put the blocks just to prevent this mold from trying to escape. Great. So I went ahead and put in that screw. That's going to keep this in place and indexed for the fitting of the bow part. And this is a dry fit. So we don't want to glue things together until you know you have everything kind of fitted and exactly where you want it to be. Because you can always make modifications. If you're not happy with how this looks or how the blocking came out, you can make a new block. All of these molds need to come out of the boat, so it's very important to put some packing tape or masking tape. I wouldn't use duct tape, it's a little too thick, but anyway, use that on the molds at each station. You don't want squeeze out from your bottom plank to glue your, or even any of your plank edges, really. Don't want that to glue your whole boat together with all of these molds, because it'll be a real mess to try and get it out of there.